Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to our last talk of the semester in Environmental, Ecological, and Rural Studies. I am Liliana Saboya, a member of the team of the doctoral program in Environmental and Rural Studies at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. Thank you very much for joining us to this very interesting talk offered by our special guest, Professor Anne McDonald. She is a professor at the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies at Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. Professor McDonald's explore research topics such as global warming, biodiversity loss, and food security in everyday life, analyzing their impacts and the role of human activities. She investigates how humans' actions contribute to environmental concerns and seek to develop effective policies and solutions. Through her research, she aims to understand the complexities of environmental challenges and advocate for informed decision-making to address them. The conference of Professor McDonald will be Eye Gear and Refrigeration, Silent Games Changers in Sustainability, narrative from Japan. Thank you very much, Professor McDonald, for accepting our invitation. And to start, let me remind everybody that we'll have 15-minute time to ask questions to Professor McDonald. After her talk, please write them in the chat. Professor McDonald, we listen to you.
Thank you, Liliana. Well, good morning or good afternoon. For those of you in Bogota in Japan, we're at 6 a.m. in the morning. So I'm having my coffee in my mug from a beautiful chocolate shop in Bogota. So today's talk is, I'm taking us on a little journey through looking at environmental issues through the lens of environmental history. And many thanks to Dr. Erica Salazar, who's actually attending today. She studied at both Sophia University and Javeriana University. And the second part of my talk, which the refrigeration narratives, is actually work that we did together. So many thanks to Dr. Salazar for helping me be able to put something together to share with you today. We actually presented this at the Australian Environmental History Society's International Conference. And so I'm taking from that to share you some stories. So some of you may or may not be familiar with environmental history, but I'll hopefully share a little bit about it. So my outline for today is first looking at the narratives. The two narratives are, one is the trade-off discussions of female AMA divers, which in some of my appearances at Javeriana University, we have talked a little bit about. So some of you may be familiar with that. And those of you who came to Japan on Sakura Science might remember going to visit the AMA divers and going out onto the ocean with them. So this is more of a historical story that I'm sharing with you. And then looking at refrigeration and fisheries, and looking at some of the marine environmental narratives and Carolyn Merchant's ecological revolutions. And then, the last question I'd like to pose to you all is, is there no turning back? And sort of musings on potential lessons learned from the past. So why marine environmental history? So environmental history might be a new, unheard of or unfamiliar academic discipline. As introduced by Liliana, I'm usually teaching environmental policy and really focusing on food production, food security, but also, climate policy and biodiversity, sustainable use and conservation related policies, etc. They're all intertwined. But as a minor, I do teach environmental history at Sophia University, and I love environmental history because I think that it's a wonderful it offers us, I believe, a wonderful opportunity to really explore our past relations, human society's relationships with nature. So if we look at sort of the academic discipline of environmental history, it often Robert Nash from the University of California, Berkeley, he's often said to be the father of environmental history, and this is from the 1970s. And this paper that I'm just sharing with you here, it's a thought piece that was written by Jeffrey Bolster in 2006 and published in the Environmental History Journal. And he's writing in 2006, which in a way seems a long time ago, from 2024 we're at now. But when you're looking at the development of an academic discipline that started in the 1970s, his paper in 2006 is saying, hey, environmental historians, you need to look more at the ocean. We need to look at, it's not just looking at what have been the relations between humans and nature over time on land, but if the globe is 70% of planet Earth is the ocean, then we really need to be looking and trying to understand better our connections with the ocean, or as he writes here, that historians really need to take seriously the challenge to historicize the ocean. So this is an attempt, a very, very small baby step of an attempt to try and contribute to Bolster's flagging of the challenge that we need to start collecting more historical narratives about the ocean and humans' relationship with it through time, and the impacts that human activities have had on the ocean, and vice versa. The changes in the ocean, how has that, and also how is it, to help us look more carefully at how is it changing our relationships. So my narratives today are the female freedivers of Japan and whaling and tuna fisheries, but particularly the tuna fisheries. So I guess, one question, I find myself asking myself, but also people ask me, is why would you do research of the female freedivers in Japan? The as written here with the Chinese characters, they're ocean plus women. So women of the ocean, or matriarchs of the ocean, some people refer to them as. So three of the questions that do guide my research, how might gender influence or be an influencing factor in resource management approaches? Also, how can cultural identity be a leverage of resource management and practices? But for the purpose of today, for marine environmental history, it's number two. It's question two that I'm really interested in. And that's looking at technological innovation. And what often seems as an indiscriminate adoption of new technologies aimed at efficiency, higher yields is often seen as a driver of environmental degradation and resource depletion in fisheries. So a question that I am trying to pose is, can something be learned from the trade-off debates in the case of the free divers, or female free divers? Can something be learned from the trade-off debates and collective decisions to adopt or reject new technologies? So Caroline Merchant, out of the US, she's a beautiful scientific historian, environmental historian, and also has done some brilliant work in ecofeminism. She came up with what she calls ecological revolutions. And, her first sort of case study for this was looking at the changes in landscape, but also peoplescape, the environmental changes that were a result of the settling of the east coast of the US. So she looks at how agricultural technologies that were introduced by the first European settlers and then developed, how that really changed the environment. So she's looking at how, when when in the case of agriculture, when you go from using shovels and manual labor is basically your tool for tilling land and planting and harvesting, etc., to planting machines and tractors and harvesting machines. What impact does that have? So looking at the adoption of an application of technological innovation, and that it's an example of humans' use of nature, the potential socioeconomic benefits, which are often perceived as outweighing the consequences, even if what's adopted has negative consequences. So keeping Merchant's environmental revolutions in mind, the Diver, and I'm hoping the refrigerator narratives may provide hopefully a starting point for reflection on how technological advancement driven by utilitarian views of ecosystems and nature has contributed to marine resource depletion in the Pacific, especially when we're looking at refrigeration technology. So first the divers, then we'll move to refrigeration. In one thing, for any historian, what's important is being able to have access to rich data. We have oral history, so the transmission of historical information through oral traditions, but then there's also the written tradition. And, depending on where you are, or depending what narratives you're searching for, they might be rich in both or might be only in one. Japan is a wonderful country, I think, for historians of any kind, whether it's economic, political, or in my case, environmental history, because it's rich in written data that take you back centuries. And so I was able to find lots of written record about the adoption of new technologies into the diver communities from all around Japan in the late 19th century, specifically in the 1880s. So when gear was introduced into Japan, in the late 1880s, there were discussions, and it's thanks to written record that we're able to say, yes, there were discussions. I'm not making them up. It's not a figment of my imagination. And unless we devise a travel machine that can take us back in time and actually go there and then bring us back to the future again to say, yes, I did hear those conversations, without this kind of rich written documentation. It's just sort of hearsay. Anyways, what are some of the written records? I'll try to keep that really short. Well, you had different examples. You had, one community that said, adoption will be able to see better. If you can see better, that means that you might harvest more, and that might put at risk our very livelihoods. We don't want to over harvest, because if we over harvest, that might exhaust the very resources that our livelihoods depend on. So they took a very precautionary approach in quite a severe way, where they said, we reject the technology. We're not going to adopt the gear. And some people might think, but it's just gear. This community felt that no, it could put at risk the resources that we depend on. Another community said, well, we acknowledge the risk, but we'd like to adopt the technology because, if you can see better and have your eyes protected when you submerge yourself beneath the surface to, search for abalone or different seaweeds or shellfish, it'd be good to have. But they regulated. They said, okay, one gear among 6 people, and you have to share. So 1 hour for one person, then you switch to the next person, the next one, this one. Then another community said, no rules, everyone. It's a free-for-all for everyone. And what's interesting to note about this is the community that initially said, no, the risks are too big. They held out for about 15 years, and then they adopted the technology. However, when they adopted it, they said, now we've got to make sure that we address the potential risks of overuse, exhaustion of resources. So they came up with, they increased their no-take fishing zones. They increased their seedling release activities so that they were always replenishing the stocks. And they also came up with regulations of time, how much time you should be limited. If you're more efficient in your harvesting, then you don't need to be in the ocean as long, was their way of thinking. But I was thinking, this is very sophisticated resource management, and the discussions, the trade-off discussions were absolutely, I think, fantastic when you're thinking that some of these people had never even gone to formal school, and yet they're having these very sophisticated that are quite interesting. Sorry, I'm having a few technical difficulties here, so I'm hitting things and I think I muted myself for a bit. My apologies. Okay, so then they go from eye gear to the next is introducing the wetsuit. If you have a wetsuit, it protects your body. You can stay in the ocean longer. You can avert jellyfish stings, and you can harvest all year round. So you can increase your economic gains as well, right? Because if you're, rather than fishing only in the summer months, you've got more time, you're bringing in more, therefore your family income increases as well. But there's always negatives to any positive. You have a benefit, you're also going to have a cost. And the cost, or the potential negative cost, was seen that, you might overharvest due to longer time in the ocean. So, there were discussions on, do you and how should you? For a while there was like, let's share the top and bottom, but eventually they moved to everyone has their own wetsuit. And we see that in 2007, restrictions of 8 hours to 4 hours, because they realized that they were sort of at the limits of their harvesting. Wetsuit technology, I'm going to move faster through this. So the different technological innovations that were introduced and adopted were the eye gear, masks as we call them now, the wetsuit, and also the fins. The fins allow you to go deeper. If you can go deeper, you can harvest usually better abalone, etc. So the next technology that's introduced, or the last really for the AMA, is the scuba tank. And at that point they say, we are, this is not a good idea. And what's interesting is not only the one community that I focus on in Ishikawa Prefecture said, no, we're not going to adopt. All female free AMA free diver communities around Japan all rejected the technology. And then you say, well, why? Most of the communities, what often they've said is that, well, one, we adopted the so-called simple technologies of goggles and wetsuits and fins, and we were facing resource management problems because we're over harvesting. And if just these simple technologies lead to that, then a scuba tank would just like put us over the tipping point. And our fisheries might collapse as a result of these technologies that we've adopted. So, but it didn't come fast. The one community that I interviewed 187 AMA divers in, those older people who could remember it said that it was a discussion that took 3 years till they came to their final decision, and a final collective no said, no scuba tanks, none. And to this day, it's the same thing. Another thing that they said is it's because of our cultural identity as AMA divers. So we see that sometimes cultural identity can also be a leverage in resource management in those trade-off discussions for technological innovation, to adopt or not to adopt. So before we move into my refrigerator narrative, and again, I really want to call out a thanks to Dr. Erica Salazar for walking through this narrative with me, because it's a little bit, it took a little bit more research than the AMA divers. I mean, the AMA divers was me sitting down, going on boats. You know, it's a different time. It's very field-based and a lot of time spent in the field. But for the refrigerator one, we had to sit down at a desk and really try and do some things. And Erica, Dr. Salazar, did a lot of help with me on that one. But before I go to the narratives, I want to look at sort of tuna catches in the 21st century, consumption and conservation status, especially when we're looking at Japan. You know, when Japan and tuna, Japan has a love affair with tuna, but I would say it's a recent love affair with tuna, and I'll get to that in a moment. But its current love affair with tuna, when we look at the global tuna catches, 25% of the global tuna catches consumed in Japan. This trend is changing. You know, there's a competition between China and Japan, and you know, for me, it doesn't matter if those percentages get higher in China compared to Japan. What is a concern is that Asia really, when we're looking not just at tuna, but other marine species, the consumption, when we're looking at the percentages of consumption, that, you know, Asia is really an area that needs a lot more attention, because I think that it sort of holds the key to our ability, or perhaps inability, to do a better job at fisheries management, both in the region and globally. So when we look at again, the global tuna catches, what really is of, you know, of concern is when you look at the fact that 70 to 90% of high-grade, high-end tuna, specifically the Pacific bluefin tuna and southern bluefin tuna, are consumed in Japan. Wow. Japan ranks second to Indonesia in total global tuna catches, and 70.5% of total global catches of principal market tuna were harvested from the Pacific in 2008. So what's you know, there's different types of tuna, as we all know, but you know, maybe when we're shopping, we don't really think about this so much, but, you know, what kind of tuna are you consuming? And what might be the IUCN ranking of it? You know, when you go to the red list, you know, what's the ranking? So if you look at the Pacific bluefin, according to IUCN, the January 2021 status is a decreasing. Atlantic bluefin tuna, unknown. Least concerned, the status, because IUCN gives them different status. Unknown southern bluefin, endangered, but good to know, it's increasing, according to IUCN. Big eye tuna, decreasing. Yellowfin tuna, decreasing. Albacore tuna, decreasing. And skipjack tuna, decreasing. So why should we be concerned about declining tuna stocks? Well, a big one is when you're talking about the trophic cascade effect, that if you take out all the tuna, that might lead to a trophic cascade, and we might see ecosystem collapse. Take out the top predator, you know, what are the repercussions of that? Well, it doesn't look so good, according to some scientists. So we really need to pay attention to, you know, the extraction and the rates of extraction, the numbers of extraction of tuna. And we have the additional pressures right now. Pollution. I know that some people will claim that, you know, if you look at the warnings out there for pregnant women saying, you know, really watch your tuna consumption, because, you know, some people have referred to tuna as a toxic cocktail, because it has high rates of mercury in the flesh. But also climate change. And this has different implications. I know in the Pacific here, there's high concern, especially in the Pacific Island countries that rely on income for their country coming from foreign fleets from Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, the US, for their paying for access for tuna fishing. And this is a concern because, you know, according to some of the scenarios, if with poleward movement, northward poleward movement, you know, tuna might not be migrating through their geopolitical borders. What will that mean to their economy? So it's not just environmental concerns that people are having when we talk about climate change in the ocean. It's also the economic concerns for countries, and it's a very complex discussion that's taking place in the Pacific right now related to potential migration due to climate change, and who has a right over those stocks. And if it's climate change that is driving the migration out of your country, do you have the rights to claim that even if it moves out of your geopolitical borders, that you still have rights to controlling the access and the payment of the access from foreign vessels? So anyways, I won't go any more on that because that's getting in the way of my historical discussion of tuna. So back to the IUCN numbers on tuna. 1 out of 7 of the principal market tuna are increasing. Great news, but it's only 1 out of 7. 1 out of the 7 population trends is unknown. So maybe 2 are kind of okay, but when you say unknown, you're like, I'm not so sure because we don't know if it's increasing or decreasing, right? But 5 out of 7 of the principal market tuna are decreasing. So a question that the environmental historian, or we hope that is asked, is how did we get here? How did we get to the point that 5 out of the 7 principal market tuna are decreasing globally? So you start looking for your stories. And in this case, I started thinking about the impact of refrigeration on tuna fisheries when I first went to interview a former whale harpooner in Japan. And this was in 1997. And he, in the oral histories that he was, his stories that he was sharing with me about being a harpooner in the 1930s and the 1940s. And then when commercial whaling was restarted after World War II by the American in Japan, because Japan was a starving nation. It was protein poor. And so under the Allied forces, the American government that was led, or American Allied forces that was led by MacArthur at that time, they said, okay, we're going to restart commercial whaling, and off you boats go down to the Antarctic and harvest. And what Mamoru Watanabe shared with me, and this is the quote that I'd like to share with you today, is where he said, you know, refrigeration was the game changer. Consumer distaste for salted whale meat brought back from the South Pacific drove post-war World War II refrigeration technology, first with the whaling, then blue tuna. And that really got me thinking. You know, he said that he was part of the whaling boats that went down to the Antarctic post-World War II that were sent by MacArthur. And he said, you know, they salted the whale meat, but they brought it back, and you know, it took months to get back to Japan from the Antarctic at that time. And he said by the time they arrived on the shores of Japan to share the food to a starving population, it smelled so bad. And he said most people didn't even want to eat it. And I remember him saying to me, he says, you know, even starving people can turn their noses up at something. So this led that, you know, salting whale meat that's being harpooned in the Antarctic and then taking months to transport back to Japan. That led to, we really need to upscale the refrigeration technology so that things that are caught way far offshore can be refrigerated. Now, this isn't I'll share with you, but this isn't something that just happened in post-World War II Japan, but from the turn of the 20th century in Japan. I went to Cape Town in South Africa to interview Japanese tuna fishers who were based there, to ask them about the tuna fisheries in the late 1990s. And one of the people that I met, a skipper from Kesanuma, Miyagi, Japan, said to me, he said, who would have thought that gezakana, so low quality, inferior fish, that our great-grandparents ate would become so sought after. Now, thanks to Japanese high-tech refrigeration technology, you can hold on to fatty tuna for at least 3 years. And yes, this is a bonus for tuna distributors like Mitsubishi. So that when I met him and he was talking to me, they took me to their refrigeration facilities at the port in Cape Town, South Africa. And at that time, you could freeze fish at minus 65 degrees Celsius. Now, why is that important? Well, if you freeze it at that temperature, when you thaw it, it's of this exact same quality when you first caught it. That's how good the refrigeration technology is. So there's kind of like tuna banks around the world where they can store especially the fatty tuna that Japanese absolutely love, and store it for a few years, and then sometimes control the market prices by holding back for a bit, putting it out on the market, etc. So refrigeration has many impacts, not just ecological, but on the economic sense as well. So just recall Carolyn Merchant's Ecological Revolutions that's trying to explore how technological advancement driven by utilitarian views of ecosystems and nature has contributed to the depletion in tuna stocks across the Pacific. Most people are focusing on, the boats and the nets and that type of fishing methods, fishing gear technology. But I think it's more complex than that. It's not just about how fast and how much can you take out of the ocean in one go. Where do you put it? Where do you store it once you've caught it? And with tuna, this is very important. Tuna has a very short shelf life. And this is why Japanese didn't like tuna. And if you go back into historical documents from the 17th, from the 18th century, 19th century, you see writings that are very disdainful of tuna, where they'll say, I wouldn't even feed a cat tuna because it's such an offensive fish because it goes off so fast. And it does. Without refrigeration, we would not be able to not only capture, process, and consume the amount of tuna that we're eating today. So it's not just the fishing boats, it's not just the nets, it's also the refrigerator technology that has an impact on driving the the depletion of tuna stocks globally. And specifically, my concern is in the Pacific because the rates are higher. So with refrigeration, your taste and your texture can be kept. Without it, ooh, not so good. All you have to do is go to the store, buy a little bit of that red tuna, put it on your countertop, and you will see it go this very interesting brown color. And then the shape of it just goes, almost becomes like a jelly. The water goes out, it just, the shape, you lose your shape. So, experiment at home. See what happens when you put tuna in your fridge to keep, or when you just put it on the countertop. It's a very quick experiment. You don't need that much time. And I think that will help bring home the message of why refrigeration is such a key silent game changer, because we don't think about it so much. Or maybe that's my bias. So what are also some, it's not just the technology itself, but there's also different things that are happening in time that drive it. And I know that we need to move into questions and answers, so I'm going to go through this really quickly, and probably not do it so much justice. But one of the things that I was looking at, and Dr. Erica Salazar helped me with this, we sat down and we said, anyone who's doing anything in environmental history, you need to come up with a timeline. So we started looking at, not just the technological innovation, but what were other events that were happening that might have also contributed to the drive to develop that technology. So the first one with refrigeration and tuna fisheries is you're looking at marine and territorial expansionism that was led from Japan, the great, sometimes referred to as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So we see from 1895 to 1945, Japan starts to look outward. They end their policy of self-isolation, and they start looking outwards. Now, in that, we see that in the early 1900s, specifically in 1911, we found written records by the Japanese government where they wrote that part of marine territorial expansionism efforts will include research and development of refrigeration technologies, because they knew that the further you push your boats out, you're going to need to refrigerate in some form or another, keep cool, store the fish that you catch, because you're going further distances. Then after World War II, how do you feed a starving nation? Well, you send your boats out and catch fish or whales and whale meat and bring it back to Japan. Then you see the Japanese economic miracle, 1953, high economic development. So Japan gains more purchasing power, which means with gaining more purchasing power, they're also pushing their boats out further and bringing that back to Japan. Another game changer is the 200 nautical mile limit. So countries you stay within your 200 nautical mile limit and going into the high seas. And what really becomes important is because all countries have 200 nautical mile limits. So if Japan wants to go into the shores within the exclusive economic zone, which is the 200 nautical mile limit, within countries like the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, Samoa, etc. Well, they're going to have to pay to get access in to do the fishing, which means for Japan, they didn't want to land the fish on those islands and do processing. They wanted to keep it on their boats and bring it back to Japan. So that was also a driver of further developing refrigeration technologies that will not only maintain the quality, maintain sort of a certain freshness of the fish, but from the 1970s on, you see that Japanese, it's a wealthier country, so their culinary tastes are also being developed, and you have a more discerning consumer saying, I want it to be tastier. I want it to be a finer quality. So this also has an impact on how refrigeration technology is developed at that time, where they're aiming at how do we ensure the best of quality can be maintained through refrigeration technology, so that consumers in Japan that want that good, fatty Pacific bluefin tuna, how do we preserve that and be able to provide that to the customer? Another change is when we see, and this is a good change, where we see from the 1990s onward, we've got the Rio Earth Summit, where we see more global discussions about trade versus conservation, and this starts to put a little bit more, focus on, what are some of our ecological, environmental concerns, and we see that the tuna starts to get a little bit more discerning eyes looking at it as far as from the conservation side goes. So mapping it out, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is something that Erica worked on with me, and just sort of charting out, where the different fishing grounds that Japanese fishing boats were entering. And this looks at 1934 to 1940. So we see Japan all the way down close to Australia moving. So the marine tuna fisheries was a very big part of Japanese territorial expansionism. I've shared these stories already. So, this is where we see that Japan's moving out, moving further. And we also see that already from 1965, southern bluefin tuna in the higher latitudes of, we see Japan really going into those areas. So again, recall where we're at now. 25% of the global tuna catch is consumed in Japan. 70 to 90% of high-grade, high-end tuna, specifically the Pacific bluefin tuna and southern bluefin, are consumed in Japan. Thank you, refrigeration. It's not just the fishing gear that has allowed this. So, knowing the past, what do we do, or how do we build the pathways to future sustainability is a question that also begs an answer. We've got all these targets. We've got, sustainable development goals, 2030, where I believe, zero hunger is one. And among the other 17 goals. How are we going to reach them? We've got all these targets. We're constantly looking to the future, and we're saying we need to ensure sustainable futures for all. But as someone who dabbles a little bit in environmental history, I think that we also need to be asking, how did we get here? And in looking at how did we get here, can that information, can these lessons learned from the past be applied to current day, and in this case, fish stock management and marine environmental problem solving? I don't have the answer to that question, but maybe we can talk about something today. You might be a pessimist and say, oh God, there's no turning back. But I think that's not the question that we should focus on. It's more about, where do we go from here now that we've had explored the past, and how did we get to where we are today? How do we make a shift, transition, so that we take ourselves off the path of full depletion of tuna stocks? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McDonald, for your insightful presentation. We will now begin the question and answer session for our participants. Please be reminded that you can submit your questions in the meeting chat.
I always think it's always hard to get that first one question going. And then once you get that, then they start to roll. But or maybe I was talking here, there, and everywhere, and it was a bit too incoherent, my narratives. My apologies if that's the case. Well, I guess I have a question for some of you. Have you ever thought about the impact that refrigerators or refrigeration of food has on resources? How we not only extract them, but consume them. Hi, Professor Gomez.
Don't Yes, I have been in refrigeration. Actually, I think one of the elements that promoted invasive species in islands was the lack of refrigeration.
Mm, interesting. Ah, so we have to look at all different sides of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But you know, I'm always I was at a at some meetings where there was discussions about introducing refrigeration into small scale fisheries in Pacific Island states. And I remember just kind of raising my hand and saying, can we have some discussion on this? Because yes, there's the benefits of introducing refrigeration. But you know, my concern is that often in when we're looking specifically at fisheries, what happens is that you know, you know, where you don't have refrigeration in communities, there's, you know, you catch what you can consume. You catch what you know you can sell that day. Whereas when you've got refrigeration, it's like, oh, well, we can just, you know, freeze it for a bit, or we, you know, and so that sometimes the extraction rates are increased without, you know, coming up with a balance for that. You know, it also depends on the you know, the capacity of your refrigeration. So small scale, you know, it's kind of like, well, you don't need to bring in, you know, huge refrigerations. You don't need to build big facilities that in the end, maybe that overseas development aid project could, you know, pay for. But, you know, the local communities, once the ODA project is over and those agencies move out, who takes care of the resources? So I see that there's a question in chat, so I'll stop there.
Yes, we have another question about from Erica Salazar. Thank you for your talk, Professor McDonald. As always, great to hear you. Is the future of the AMA divers in Japan? Is there any strategy to conserve the traditional practices? What challenge are they facing?
Well, I think there are multiple challenges. One are the socioeconomic that I think all artisanal fishers are facing around the world, and that is you know, as standards of living increase, you know, artisanal fisheries aren't the first choice anymore, right? Because they're manually, physically demanding. So if you can have a job, let's say at a convenience store, 7-Eleven or Family Mart, you know, that pays, you know, you don't have to go out into the ocean. You know, we're seeing that younger people, the younger generations are choosing other employment opportunities over the diving, just because there aren't the physical demands, and also it's you know, it's for some, you know, it's more reliable. There's also a social net where you know, you'll pay into the system, you'll have a pension, you know, you'll have health care. And so, you know, there's the socioeconomic drivers that are having an impact. But also climate change. So even if you want to continue as an AMA diver, you know, the ocean temperatures are increasing. And as a result of that, you know, we're seeing in some areas where, you know, it's 1.74 degrees Celsius increase, and that's having a huge impact on the marine ecosystems, and we're seeing you know, dead zones increasing, the decreases in the different seaweeds that are really critical as spawning grounds for some of the target species of the AMA divers. So there's things that are beyond their control, and trying to work with scientists to look at how can you address the decrease in seaweeds, how can you rehabilitate degraded fishing grounds, harvesting grounds, so that you can ensure the continuation of this type of fisheries. So, you know, there's factors, you know, sort of beyond their control that I think are really putting threatening the future of, well, it's not only the AMA divers, but others. I see another question. Sorry, I'm just cutting off partway through as I see something come up in chat. But maybe it's good having them come up in chat, because then I don't go on and on forever and ever with an answer that goes beyond the question. Thank you.
Don't worry, Professor. And this question is from Angela Amarillo. Thank you, Professor McDonald, for your talk. Technology is strongly attached to the large-scale economy that makes possible the commercialization of products that are harvested and produced at huge amounts. Within this scenario, what is in Japan the future for small-scale productions?
That's a really good question. I think if you're looking specifically at fisheries, I think one area that I think is a strength in Japanese fisheries is that when Japan sort of modernized, and sometimes they call it even westernizing, and they at the turn of the 20th century, when a lot of Western science led resource use and management approaches were introduced to Japan, that really had an impact on forestry and agriculture. Not to say that it didn't have in fisheries, but the one thing about fisheries that was interesting is they really maintained in the near, you have to be careful of what type of fisheries you're talking about, but in the near shore coastal fisheries, it's still very much regulated by each community. So any new technologies that are introduced, whether it's the AMA divers or it's set net fishers, or whether it's the kelp harvesters, any new technologies, any that are introduced, you have a discussion, because it has to be, the final agreement has to be through the collective whole. So they've maintained that in Japan. So I think this is a plus when you're looking at management, but that means that it really depends on each community. There's over 3,000 fishing ports in Japan. And so it's not a collective whole as far as the nation goes. The discussions are so it's more of a community silo approach. There's one area that I'm starting to look at right now is aquaculture. Capture fisheries will not feed the world, and we also need to taper our capture fisheries, not only tuna, but others as well. And the near shore, offshore, and the high seas make it a complex discussion. So I'm going to sort of try and stay away from that. But, in small scale production right now, when you're looking at the blue foods, specifically near shore, coastal fisheries, we're seeing some transitions, not only in Japan, but also overseas. And I'm working with islands, so we're looking at the development of small scale aquaculture. So that's a new technological innovation. And the one thing that we're trying to look at is where are small scale aquaculture communities really trying to take on an ecosystem-based approach in small scale aquaculture, where they're looking at not just growing something, farming something, but they're looking at how, if those activities are in the ocean, not on land, but in the ocean, are they making sure that they are rehabilitating or conserving, managing, looking at the whole ecosystem. So one example I can give is in an island where they're doing sea urchin, small scale aquaculture, and looking at seaweed transplanting. And they're also, they grow it in a certain place for a couple of years, then they're moving it into outside regions. They're increasing the no-take zones. They're really looking at whether the seaweed is proper. They're farming, but one of the end aims is actually part of what is farmed, they're also going to put out into the wild, so that it's not all farmed, but they're trying to do a combination of farmed and sort of releasing back to the natural habitats that they're also trying to maintain in this. So I'm not sure whether I'm answering your full question there, because I think that it's a big question that I'm not sure I can answer fully today. But I think that there's some interesting examples in Japan where they're looking at, you know, what are new technologies to be adopted, but how do we ensure that they're used in a way that the costs don't outweigh the benefits of those technologies?
Thank you very much, Professor Anne. And now I'm going to give the floor to our director of the doctoral program, Professor Angela Amarillo.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, Professor McDonald. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to give this final seminar talk in Conversaciones in Estudios Ambientales y Rurales. We are very pleased that you are our closing speaker for this semester, because Sofia University and Javeriana University have a long history of interaction, especially with our Facultad de Estudios Ambientales y Rurales and with our doctoral program. So we are very pleased to have you here again. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us during these four sessions of talks. We invite everyone to take action again in August and stay aware of our next invitation for our second semester of 2024 talks. We'll have another set of very interesting speakers, and we'll see you again in August. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. What an honor, and I look forward to continuing our collaborations, because thanks to Javeriana, we're able to do great things in Japan. You are just so amazing. So thank you. Arigatou gozaimashita. Gracias.
Arigatou gozaimasu.
Oh, beautiful Japanese. Thank you. Well, have a good evening. Enjoy dinner, and I think I'll see Rocco and Maria Angela and Nicholas soon, and Erica in Japan soon. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.